The PlayStation 6. When will it come out? What do we know about it so far? Well, let's dig into things. Hello there everyone, it's Aaron here from Push Square, and you may think I'm a little bit crazy to be talking about the PlayStation 6, but I would say that our current generation is in its sunset years, let's say. We're closer now to the launch of the PlayStation 6 than we are the launch of the PS5. So with that, I thought it was time to just form a picture, no matter how blurry it may be, of everything we know, everything we think we know about the PlayStation 6, so we have an idea of how Sony is shaping up its next generation of consoles. Before I get into it though, remember to subscribe to the channel for more PlayStation video content just like this. Anyway, let's get into it. So to start things out, obviously you want to know, when is this thing coming out? If we were to look at history and when previous consoles have launched, there are 7 years between both the PS3 and 4 and the PS4 and 5. That would indicate that 2027 is an ideal time for the PS5 to launch, but this generation has been anything but normal. And there's a few little tidbits here or there that indicate towards a later 2028 launch window. For starters, lead PS5 architect Mark Cerny recently stated in an interview with Tom's Guide that his work on the PlayStation 6 was multi-year. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't call 2 years multi-year. I would go a little bit further, maybe 3 or 4, but definitely at least 3 I would say, indicating that the PS6 is a little bit further away. In addition, former director of Sony Interactive Entertainment, Shuei Yoshida, stated in an interview with VentureBeat that the PS6 launching in 2028 felt right. Now obviously, Big Yoshida does not actually work at Sony anymore, so this is speculative on his part, but of course the guy was a pretty big wig at Sony and he kind of knows how they think, what are their strategies, so his opinion does hold a bit of weight, but it goes beyond just what he feels is right, because if we look at the generation itself, for one, it had a bit of a stalled launch. It was over 2 years before PS5 consoles were readily available after supremely limited supplies during the COVID pandemic. In addition, and sort of as a result of this, the PlayStation 4 generation has had a much longer rollover period, let's say, where a lot of big studios releasing their new games on both PS5 and PS4. This put together does seem to indicate that 2028 is the more likely year out of the two. Now Sony usually reveals these consoles around summertime and releases them in November, so with all of that, my big theoretical speculative release date of the PlayStation 6 is November 2028. What will this console do? What will be the big message that will convince you to upgrade over the PS5? If we look at things quite simplistically, the PS3 was about fidelity, the 4 was about online gaming and socialization, the PS5 was about performance and streamlining. The PS6 then, from what we know, is going for the PS5 but more efficient and more affordable. In that regard, Sony did make a bit of a mistake with the PlayStation 5, where its internal components and processors became more expensive as time went on, leading to the console itself to go up in price. That's why we're now getting £500 PS5s and £700 PS5 Pros, when this time last generation the PS4 could be bought for like 200 quid. Now I don't want to entirely blame Sony, inflation is certainly a factor here, but not exactly a normal thing this late in a generation, and not exactly the best way to convince people to buy your now 5-year-old console at the most expensive it's ever been. So a way that it's hoping to combat that is with its partnership with AMD. This company is going to be making the processor chips for the PlayStation 6. And with this collaboration, there are reports that a big pillar of the design philosophy is affordability. What exactly affordability means in the eyes of Sony? Who is to say? I reckon that maybe means the PS6 would be around about the same price as the PS5 now, but the hope is it gets cheaper as time goes on. That's just the theory, I suppose. But the PS6 does have a couple of ways that it's hoping to do this, to achieve this more affordable, efficient design philosophy. For one, it will allegedly continue the whole detachable disk drive Design. We saw this design introduced with the PS5 Slim and PS5 Pro, where a disc drive could be attached to a digital console and removed from a disc one. But I think what we're going to see with the PlayStation 6 is a sole digital version of the PlayStation 6 and the option to buy the disc drive down the line, similar to what they do currently with the PlayStation 5 Pro. I don't think we're going to see a digital and disc version of the PS5 at launch. Now obviously that may get a lot of people up in arms. I know people get really defensive about physical support in games, which I totally get, but end of the day, Sony's going to follow the numbers, and a lot of people are moving to digital. In addition, with this AMD partnership, AI processing and machine learning is going to be a big part of the next generation. Now we've seen it introduced a little bit with PSSR on the PS5 Pro, where the aim is to up resolution, include more graphical features without necessarily sacrificing performance. Obviously this kind of ties into the efficiency rumors with the PlayStation 6, where AI is kind of fronting a lot of the processing power rather than putting all of the onus on, the processors, the raw hardware in the PS5. Maybe that means we'll finally see the end of 30 FPS. A man can but dream. Now another reported element of this is backwards compatibility. Now reportedly the decision on who was going to produce the processor chips for the PlayStation 6 was down to Intel and AMD. But compatibility ended up being the thing that swung the vote towards AMD. You see, AMD had already produced the processor for the PlayStation 5, and switching over to Intel could have caused some potential compatibility issues. Now we all know that Sony will not be keen to repeat the mistakes of the PlayStation 3, so the rumour is PlayStation 6 will feature full backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 4 and 5. Anything before that, personally, I wouldn't count on it, but it would be a nice addition. Now, recent leaks have showcased some supposed specs for the PlayStation 6. I'm going to put these up on screen here. This isn't a technical breakdown, so, retain that information if you will, understand it if you can. But my editor did point out that the power output for the PlayStation 6 is actually less than that of the PS5. If this turns out to be true, then of course it's linking back into a console that is able to do the same things, but in a more efficient manner. What all of this means though is that the PlayStation 6 will potentially be what I would describe as a modest upgrade, which might not be what everyone is hoping for, but I do think it's actually the better approach for Sony. With the console market being the way it is, we really don't know what is next for consoles. Xbox is rumoured to be teaming up with Steam in a potential quasi-PC console hybrid, and that just kind of leaves the market up in air. And I think then that it makes sense for Sony not to necessarily compete with going with the biggest and glitziest graphical experience, which inevitably is going to cost a lot of money. Instead, it's going for something that does what it already does, but better and quicker and for cheaper, basically. Obviously, we're going to see sparklier games running better anyway with a lot of the machine learning. I think that's really going to revitalize or revolutionize, I suppose, the games development process. But I do personally think that this is probably the better approach for Sony, because if it did decide to go down the more pro route, we are going for the best gaming experience that you can get for a plug and play console, you are talking about a console that might be pushing upwards of £1,000 at this point, and then people start asking, why not switch to PC? Now, something that these reports currently do not detail is how long of a support period there will be for the PlayStation 5. However, I think it's safe to assume that it will be longer than what we've seen with the PlayStation 4. Sony initially stated that it would support the PlayStation 4 for 3 years, but COVID has kind of curtailed that, where maybe the last year or so we've seen PlayStation 4 releases take a step back. However, if this is a sort of incremental upgrade over the PlayStation 5, I can see that lasting much longer with the next generation. Now, what about the design? What will it look like? Obviously, we can't really comment on how this thing will look. There's been no leaks in that regard, and if there have been, there's every potential it'll just be the dev kits like we saw with the PS5. But what we do know is that Sony is aiming, in line with its efficiency and affordability factor, trying to make this a much more condensed console, let's say. Now, I'm not saying that this thing's going to be absolutely teeny tiny, but I think we can all agree a little bit smaller than the original launch PlayStation 5 is going to be a good thing. But there is actually a very sort of mundane and practical reason for this. It's reported that Sony is hoping to reduce the footprint of the PS5 because not only will it then obviously be more compatible with people's TV cabinets, but it will also save them an absolute fortune in shipping. If something is bigger, it needs more packaging. If it's heavier, it potentially costs more to send. Now, it might only be a few pence or whatever per unit, but if Sony's selling upwards of 100 million units per generation, that's a lot of cheddar to be saved. Obviously, every PlayStation has looked vastly different, and I expect no less from the PlayStation 6, so who's to say, but I think smaller is definitely the direction Sony is wanting to go in. Now, do we know anything about any games coming to the PlayStation 6? Obviously, the console hasn't been announced itself, so we don't have any official words there, but there have been some leaks on websites like LinkedIn, which recently alluded to the fact that Rocksteady is developing a game, rumoured to be a Batman game, with the PlayStation 6 in mind. And I think it's safe to assume that games like The Witcher 4 or Hideo Kojima's Fizzant? Are we going with Fizzant? How would you say that game? But both of those will likely be PlayStation 6 games. And as an aside to this, there has long been rumours that Sony will be releasing a PlayStation 6 handheld that will launch alongside the PlayStation 6, but I think that in itself is enough for its own video there. So that's been everything we know so far. Hopefully this has formed some kind of blurry image of what the next console generation will look like from Sony, but do let me know what you would like from the next generation. I'm genuinely quite curious to see what people expect, what people need from the next generation to consider an upgrade. Is it entirely a price thing? Is it a feature thing? If so, which features would you like to see? I am kind of like at a loss at the moment as for what I really want from a PlayStation 6. I think I'm going to need a bit more thought into it. But do let me know down in the comments below, and while you're there, remember to subscribe to the channel for more PlayStation video content just like this. Anyway, until next time, I've been Aaron, and this has been Push Square.